Shalom Bethel family. It is Thursday, once again time to review our Torah discussion from Bethel in Norfolk this past Shabbat. This past Shabbat we read Parshat Mishpatim. Mishpatim is an entire list of laws, really a legal code. And it's funny because we call the Torah often our book of law. But the truth is, up until this point, all through the book of Bereshit, and so far most of the book of Shemot, that's the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus, we haven't actually done a lot of law, right? It's all been stories. In many cases, in Judaism, it is our stories from which we draw the law, right? We learn the stories, we get the values from the stories, and we turn those stories into law. Mishpatim challenges us to do the opposite, which is also true. Sometimes we can read the laws and from the laws learn the story of our people, learn the values, learn what we are all about. So as we turn from the story, most recently the very impactful story of the Exodus and arriving at Sinai, and now we turn to these laws, it seems like, what are we doing? In fact, very important passage. To demonstrate what I mean by drawing a story from the law, I want to turn to two verses from the Torah portion. The first is Exodus 22:20, and the second is Exodus 23:9. Very, very similar verses. 22:20 says, "And you shall not mistreat a stranger, nor shall you oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." A verse that sounds pretty familiar, I would think. It is, in fact, the most repeated command in the Torah, and because no command is considered repeated or extraneous, if nothing else, it shows the importance. And 23:9 has a very similar sentiment. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, since you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And that one's a little different, a little more interesting, I think, because it tells us what do we mean that you were strangers in a strange land, and therefore you shall not oppress those whose land in which you were residents. In 23:9, we get the answer. You know the feelings of the stranger, right? This is about feelings. The Torah is turning to us and challenging us to react to our own oppression with empathy, with taking care of others. But you might say, well, why does it even bother to do that? That's so obvious, right? If someone treated us badly, we'd want other people to be treated better. And you'd think that to be the case, but let's face it. That's one possibility of many ways in which you can react. The two most harsh ones being, right, one, to feel empathy, right? This happened to me, and therefore I don't want this to happen to anyone else. But the other one is the exact opposite. This happened to me, and therefore I feel like I have license to do whatever I want to anyone else. And we see both reactions. In fact, it reminds me of a quote from Leon Wieseltier, said something to the effect of, the Holocaust both expanded the Jewish heart and also shrunk it. What does he mean? It means that it expanded it. It gave us this connection that we wouldn't want this to happen to anyone else. It also shrunk it, though, because we became so insular and protective that it actually closed us off somewhat. So it's not so obvious that our reaction to having been strangers in the land of Egypt would be empathy for the Egyptians or empathy for the stranger in general. So we are commanded to have empathy. It is a fascinating command. I don't want to use this as a moment, despite what's going on all around us, to have a conversation about immigration, although obviously we could, but actually to have a conversation about this aspect of reacting to the world and the disturbances we find in it with empathy. As I said, this passage shows us how from a law we can yield the story of our people. The law is don't mistreat the Egyptian because you were strangers in their land. Don't oppress the stranger because you knew what it was to be a stranger. You knew the feelings of a stranger in the land of Egypt. The law is, don't mistreat an Egyptian and don't mistreat a stranger, an other. But the message is deeper, right? It's saying that your story is a story about Egypt. It was a story of othering and oppression. And therefore, when it comes to the other, to the ger, we do not want to subject others to that same sense of othering. And the fact that this passage comes out about Egypt is not accidental, right? The very name of the country, of the nation, Egypt, in Hebrew is Mitzrayim, from the word sar, which means to be narrow or boxed in. Right? So Mitzrayim is the place of closed offness. It's the place of narrow definitions of who's in and who's out. And ultimately, the Jews, the Israelites, found themselves to be out of the narrow space. Rabbi Shai Held, in his commentary, The Heart of Torah, brings a beautiful way of connecting these laws of not mistreating the stranger, specifically being related to Egypt, to the place of narrowness. Right, Rabbi Held writes, the prohibition on oppressing widows and orphans is presented in tandem with similar prohibition on mistreating the stranger. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. That's our pasuk, our verse, Exodus 22:20. And then he says, taken together, these verses point to the heart of the Torah's vision. God wants us to create an anti-Egypt, right? Not a narrow space, but a very broad space. A society in which the weak and defenseless are protected rather than exploited, loved rather than degraded. What a beautiful message. And what a beautiful telling of the story of the Jewish people. And by the way, that story of othering for the Jewish people is a story that continues on and on throughout the millennia after Egypt. We time and again find ourselves the stranger, find ourselves the other. Right? There's a story from the JUFJ Labor Seder Haggadah that was printed in 2012. Immigration was a difficult time in my family's history, and there wasn't much room for pride. It feels vulnerable to write about the sacrifices one's family has made even during immigration. My grandmother, who was a well-regarded high school teacher in Belarus, found work sewing in a factory. My grandfather, a highly educated man and a mining engineer, worked as though it's tempting to say, became a hotel janitor. My aunt, a highly trained music teacher, cleaned houses. My father, a computer programmer, worked at house construction sites briefly. Right? We come to new places and we are then the stranger. We are then the other. That's obviously a more recent story. But we can go back to the Middle Ages. A letter from a foreign Jew living in Egypt in the 11th century. A Jew, living among other Jews, by the way. In a book by Mark Cohn, Poverty and Charity in the Jewish Community of Medieval Egypt, right? This Jew, this Yid writes, I have no cover and no couch and no work to which I can resort. I am from a faraway place, namely Rakhba in Iraq. I have been here 3 months, and none of our co-religious have paid attention to me or fed me with a piece of bread, right? Not even my fellow Jews are taking care of me. I'm even othered by them. So I have turned to God, the exalted, and to my master to do for me what is appropriate for every wayfarer, and give me as charity a little money to raise my spirits, for I am miserable and dying from hunger. Dogs get their fill these days with bread, but not I. Right? Once again, we see that it's not just that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, we have been strangers time and again. We know that feeling, but you know what? We don't have an exclusive right to that, right? That reaction of being hard-hearted and closing off our hearts because we've been through so much, it's not for us to take care of others. No, the Torah says, because of your story, because you were in Egypt, you were in the narrow place, and you knew what it was to be othered. No, now you have to respond with the opposite. You have to take that feeling and you have to respond to others with empathy, with love, and with compassion. And I think that's a challenge for all of us, right? Particularly as the world seems to spin out of control faster than we can keep up, there is this reaction to become the narrow space, to shut out those who might be a risk or that might be other or who just aren't my problem, right? They're not my problem. In Mishpatim, we get our story from the law. No, that is not our story, Jewish people. We are not the ones who continue humanity's mistake of narrowing and othering. No, we must widen our hearts, broaden our communities, open ourselves up with compassion to those who find themselves as others for whatever reason. And let's face it, we're not only talking about immigrants and impoverished people. In this society, we are othering at a rate like, I don't know, that we've ever seen before. And the effects are traumatic on all of us. Will we rise to the challenge to open our hearts, to build the anti-Egypt, the broader society? And not just in broad politics, but in our life, in every decision that we make, when we are faced with anxiety, when we are feeling like we're not sure how to react, will we take that risk? Because we were slaves, we were othered in the land of Egypt, and time and again, will we end that cycle to make this world a better place, as is our mission? I hope we're all able to make those decisions, every decision when we're faced with it, with bravery and trust. Trust in God, trust in the Torah, that this is the proper path and is our path to making the world a better place. May we all do so, and may this world reflect that effort speedily in our time. I wish you a Shabbat Shalom for the coming Shabbat, and look forward to speaking with you again soon.